This is a production of Cornell University.
Yeah, today I'll be discussing our work on using deep learning to monitor and forecast vegetation growth. And I just want to confirm that, yeah, I'm a computer scientist, so my knowledge of crop science or agronomy is quite limited, but I'm definitely trying to learn. And as well, if you have any questions or you're confused about some of the technical aspects, feel free to stop me and ask questions. Cool, so I guess just a brief outline. So in this talk, I'll start by introducing why crop monitoring matters, and then I'll give a short introduction to some of the key ideas behind deep learning. Then I'll dive into a project in collaboration with Ying Sun's group on resolving SIF, or solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, at extremely fine resolutions using remote sensing data with a technique we call coarsely supervised smooth UNet. Next, I'll discuss a project with Ariel Ortiz-Bobea's group on forecasting crop yields using a graph neural network approach to capture spatiotemporal correlations. And then I'll conclude with some general thoughts and future directions. Okay, so why does crop monitoring matter? Well, I'm sure a lot of you are aware, but just to reiterate, so if we know in advance that a crop failure is likely, we could organize aid efforts to help prevent food insecurity and famine. And at a national level, yield predictions can help inform import and export decisions so governments can know how much food might need to be imported. At a local level, farmers can also use these yield predictions or monitoring reports to make better management decisions. Also, seed companies need to be able to predict the performance of new hybrids under various environmental conditions. So on top of this, climate change is also having a huge impact, since crop production is extremely sensitive to fluctuations in climatic factors, such as temperature and moisture. And climate change has already reduced agricultural productivity growth by about 21%. So it's thus critical to monitor how vegetation is reacting. Okay, so how is this currently done in practice? Well, a lot of crop forecasts in the US still depend on field surveys where experts go into the field and observe how the crops are doing. Farmers can also provide their opinions about growing season conditions. And this is great because experts clearly know a lot, they have a lot of experience, and they can directly observe the conditions on the ground. Unfortunately, this also requires significant human effort and cost to collect this data. So even in the US, I think the USDA generally only publishes forecasts every month. And in developing countries, this type of data is even more inaccessible. And it also involves subjective opinions. On the other hand, there are also these crop simulation models which provide more process-based mechanistic simulations of crop growth. So there's a lot of really cool scientific knowledge in these models, but they're not perfect. They can produce pretty biased predictions. They require a lot of assumptions about management practices and are computationally expensive. So I won't really go into these models in this talk, but integrating these mechanistic models into machine learning to provide more prior knowledge could be an interesting direction for future work. Okay, so we discussed field surveys and simulation models. So why might machine learning be useful here? So we know that crop performance is a really complex function of weather, soil conditions, moisture, and a whole bunch of other factors. Machine learning can actually learn these complex relationships from data, or at least we hope, and figure out which variables are relevant. And a lot of this data is already being collected in near real time, such as with satellite images or weather station reports. And we have this massive amount of data that's coming in. We need algorithms to be able to kind of make sense of and analyze this huge amount of data. And hopefully, since this data is already being collected in near real time, ideally we could detect issues before a human is able to go into the field. Okay, so now I'll give a really brief introduction of some of the key ideas behind deep learning. I know I don't have much time here, so I'll just try to give the basic intuitions. So The idea behind what's called supervised machine learning is basically just to learn a function that can take an input and map it to an output. And sometimes we can actually write down this function like we know the mathematical formula. But if we don't know this function, we might hope that we could learn this function from observing a lot of data. Okay, so in the supervised machine learning setting, we have a bunch of training examples. So each example is a pair of an input and an output. So basically, the algorithm is trying to learn how to use the inputs to predict the output. So you have the input here, and then the function f is trying to take an input and predict what the output should be. So let's just quickly cover some examples of how this might be useful. So in everyday life, if you've used email, you've probably actually encountered the spam detection algorithm, which can take an email and try to classify if it's spam or not. In image classification, you take an image and you want to predict what is in the image, like a person, dog, car, or etc. And this sounds very basic, but it's actually a very critical building block if you want to have any system that can perceive the world, such as a robot or a self-driving car. And moving on towards examples more relevant to plant science. So in plant disease detection, you might have an image of a plant leaf, and you want to be able to identify if it's diseased or healthy, and like maybe even what kind of disease it is. In land cover classification, we might have a satellite image of this region, and we want to know what parts of the region are covered by different land uses, such as farming, grassland, urban uses, etc. And finally, in crop yield prediction, I've mentioned this. So basically, let's say that we have a bunch of data about weather, soil, environmental conditions, and genotype, etc. And the goal would be to forecast the eventual crop yield. Okay, so as you've seen, these inputs and outputs can pretty much be any form of data, like text, images, vectors, videos, and any kind of data you have, like probably some people have attempted to use machine learning on this. But just to start with a very simple example, let's just say that you have a vector of some numeric variables that you observe, and you want to predict a single number as the output. Yeah, so kind of the most basic approach you might be familiar with is linear regression. So you might be asking, is linear regression really machine learning? And you can actually argue that it's one of the most basic machine learning algorithms, and it's also a building block behind more sophisticated deep learning models. So just briefly in this linear regression setting, let's say that we just have two input variables. So like the July average high temperature and July precipitation. And we, let's say, model the yield as a really simple linear function of these two inputs. Yeah, so here we have the f of x, the yield, as just a linear function of these two input variables. And so the algorithm has to learn the weights or the coefficients that produce the most accurate predictions on this training data. Okay, so this is great if your function that you want to model is actually linear. But a lot of real world phenomena is nonlinear. So what do we do in this case? So it turns out that just stacking multiple linear functions is not enough, because that will still produce a linear function. So however, a key insight from a long time back is that if we use nonlinear functions between the linear functions, this can allow the neural network to approximate almost any function to a high degree of accuracy. So basically, again, we still have our kind of linear function on the left here. So this gray node is basically taking this linear sum, or sorry, the weighted sum of these inputs. And the only change so far is that we just add a nonlinear function at the end of this. The nonlinear function can really be anything. Here, this is a sigmoid, which kind of is convenient if you want to squash the number to be between 0 and 1. And of course, nowadays in neural networks, ReLU is more common. I won't really go into this. There's just a bunch of different nonlinear functions you can use. Okay, so now recall that each of these gray nodes basically takes the linear weighted sum of the inputs and then passes it through a nonlinear function. And then the idea is that we actually use the output of these gray nodes as the input for another linear layer. So basically, we just stack a bunch of these linear layers together, where the final layer is kind of computing a linear function of the intermediate values. So the result of this is just a complex nonlinear function whose weights can be learned from data. Okay, so how are these weights or function parameters learned? So I won't get into this in too much detail, but basically, there is an algorithm called backpropagation that can do it. So intuitively, what it's doing is, let's just start with some really random weights. So the function is outputting a completely random garbage prediction. And we want to just compute the error of this prediction, this random prediction, against the true value that we want to infer. So obviously, this error will be really large if the predictions are just random. But the key idea is that we can actually use calculus to figure out how to adjust the weights in a way that can reduce the error. And specifically, it's actually computing the partial derivative of the error with respect to every weight in the function or the network using the calculus chain rule. And you could actually probably compute this by hand if you wanted to, if you've taken calculus, but thankfully nowadays the software can compute this automatically. Okay, so then we just adjust the weights. They're kind of like little knobs that you can turn in the direction that we know will reduce the error by a little bit. And then you just repeat this process on a new batch of data. And of course, the caveat is that this is not guaranteed to find the optimal weights, but it's often enough to work in practice. Okay, so that's actually kind of the basics behind how all neural networks work. There are a bunch of specialized forms of neural networks for different types of data, and I won't discuss this in detail, but basically you can use recurrent neural networks if your data is a sequence, like text or audio or time series. If your data is more of an image that has like local structure, you can use convolutional neural networks. Basically, these kind of learn features from very localized regions of the image and can start to aggregate them further into more complex and abstract features. And this could also be used for video data, hyperspectral images, or even time series. Like the number of dimensions is flexible. And then a more specialized form that I'll discuss today is called graph neural networks. And it's useful if the data has a graph structure of nodes and connections. An obvious example is social networks. An example that we'll use today is counties in the US, where each node is a county, and then the connections between counties represent the fact that these counties are adjacent or somehow linked. Okay, so that's kind of the basics behind deep learning. Some pros of deep learning are that the functions that it can learn are extremely expressive, and they could, in principle, learn almost any function. So they work really well for a lot of tasks, like machine translation, image recognition, speech recognition, protein folding, etc. But the downside is that neural networks typically require a lot of data to train on. So if there's not enough data, they can often overfit by essentially memorizing the training data sets. So think of this as just like you memorize the solutions to the answer key on the homework, but this is not going to help you actually learn how to solve new problems. Okay, so to avoid this, we often use a held out validation set to check if this is happening. Stopping training early is often enough to prevent overfitting. You basically have this just held out validation set that you don't train on, and you can see how well it's generalizing. Yeah, and it's also hard to interpret how the neural network makes predictions. This is an area that's actively being researched, but it's still kind of tricky. Okay, so if you're interested in learning more about machine learning, there are a bunch of resources, such as the CS5785 course taught by Vladimir Kuleshov, whose videos are actually online on YouTube. And there's also this Intro to ML class whose videos are also online. But if you just want to quickly start coding and you don't have time for a class, you can also try, for example, PyTorch's tutorials, which PyTorch is one of the most commonly used deep learning frameworks nowadays. And you can get started pretty quickly. Okay, are there any questions up to this point on kind of basics? Cool. Okay, so now I'll discuss this project basically on monitoring vegetation using SIF, solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, at extremely fine resolutions. So this paper was recently submitted to this ICHCAI 22 conference, and a short version was accepted at the NeurIPS Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning workshop. Okay, so some of you might be familiar with SIF already, but basically, just to motivate what it is, the goal, again, is here we want to use satellites to monitor vegetation or crop growth from space. So a lot of work uses vegetation indices, such as NDVI, which are simple combinations of a few spectral bands. By contrast, solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, unlike NDVI, actually has direct mechanistic linkages to photosynthesis. So it can directly sense photosynthesis that is going on, and it's thus better at VIs at predicting crop yields or other crop monitoring tasks like detecting heat stress and drought. But the problem is that SIF is actually a very difficult signal to measure from space. So existing satellites tend to produce quite noisy data and can only capture about 3-kilometer resolution at most. And even these coarse resolution measurements have pretty limited geographic coverage. So within a large area, such as many square kilometers, SIF can actually vary dramatically between farms due to crop type, management practices, and so on. So our goal is to predict SIF at a finer resolution so that we can kind of detect differences between individual fields. Okay, so this is a task that we call coarsely supervised regression. It's also commonly known as downscaling in a lot of literature. So basically, if we want to predict SIF at a very fine resolution, we can use fine resolution satellite imagery from Landsat, plus some other features. So our goal is to learn this mapping from the fine resolution features to the fine resolution SIF. However, the twist is that during training, we only have access to coarse resolution SIF labels that are at a much coarser resolution. So we actually don't really have fine resolution labels to train on. So we call this problem coarsely supervised regression, where like we have this input tile of features that's at a fine resolution, and we have like the coarse level SIF of the entire tile. But we actually want to infer what is SIF at each of the individual pixels in the image. So this task is really difficult and underdetermined. Like even if you know the average SIF of the whole tile is 0.6, there are like a nearly infinite number of possibilities for pixel SIFs that average to the correct value. So it's not a traditional supervised learning problem. So to address this, we kind of need to introduce some inductive biases, such as localization. This one is pretty obvious. Like each pixel SIF should only depend on nearby pixels' features. Like it doesn't really make sense if you want to predict SIF of this pixel to look a few kilometers away at other areas. And then there's also smoothness. So this is kind of implicit that we're assuming that pixels with similar Landsat reflectance and land cover type should correspond to similar SIF. So of course, like if the features don't really explain SIF that well, then you wouldn't expect the model to perform too well. Let me just check if there's any questions. Okay. Yeah, so I won't go into this. Basically, these plots kind of show that this assumption that similar reflectance is often correlated with similar SIF holds. Okay, so how is this task often done currently? A lot of baselines use a very averaging-based approach, where during training, they train a model at a coarse resolution by just taking the average of each feature or variable across the entire tile. So like here we have the average reflectance band 1, reflectance band 2, temperature, etc. And then given all these averages across the whole tile, you can kind of train some regression model, like a linear regression or a neural network, to output the SIF of the tile. And then if you want to predict at a fine resolution, you could just try porting this model over to the fine resolution data. But the problem is that during training time, all this spatial variation in the tile is lost. And in particular, these tiles are usually mixtures of a bunch of different crop types or farms. So that we may not even know from the data sets like how an individual homogeneous field should do. Okay, so an idea that we introduce here is to use a neural network called a UNet. So basically, UNet is commonly used for tasks where we want to output a prediction for each pixel in the image. So this is commonly used for image segmentation and so on. But the key idea is that this UNet is capable of producing a predicted SIF for each pixel, and it maintains localization such that the predicted SIF for each pixel really only depends on the nearby pixels features. And again, like this model does not need to look at fine resolution SIF labels during training. Okay, so kind of a basic idea for how to use this would be like we have our original input tile. We just pass it through some pre-processing augmentations and get another pre-processed tile. Then we pass this tile of satellite imagery and other stuff into the UNet. And the UNet can output predicted SIF for each pixel. And how does this model actually learn? Well, one constraint that we can use is that the average of our pixel SIF predictions should be about equal to the true tile SIF. So recall that we know that the true average SIF of this whole tile should be some number, like 0.6. And our goal is to output pixel predictions that match to the true value. Yeah, but of course, this is not quite enough yet because, as I mentioned, there's like an infinite number of pixel SIF predictions that could produce the correct average. And in particular, we observe that sometimes the model can often produce really extreme predictions that still produce the correct average. For example, here, this model is thinking that some fields are super high and super low SIF, and they still average to the correct value, but the predictions for individual fields are not super accurate. So to avoid this issue, we actually need some kind of regularization. So basically, we're trying to ensure that similar farms have similar predictions. By similar farms, we mean that they have similar kind of Landsat reflectance values and other features. Yeah, so basically, how we modify this is I guess we can add this smoothness loss that basically serves to encourage pixel pairs with similar input features to also have similar SIF. So we just sample random pixels that have the same crop type and try to just enforce, like, if they have similar reflectance and crop type, they should have similar SIF. Yeah, and this turns out to work pretty well. And in fact, the smoothness loss is actually not so critical because if you have the fine resolution validation set, you can actually just stop the training early before it overfits, and then that will also produce a good model. Okay, are there any questions on kind of this point, up to this point? Okay, so I guess just to quickly recap what data sets we use. So we have like input features such as Landsat, FLDAS land data, and land cover masks. And then for the SIF labels, during training time, we use coarse resolution SIF labels, such as a 3-kilometer resolution from OCO2 and CFIS. And during model selection and evaluation, we use a very small validation set of a few fine resolution SIF labels to kind of test the accuracy of the model's fine resolution SIF predictions and kind of determine, is this model even on the right track or not? So just in general, the results are pretty promising in that our model outperforms a lot of other competing approaches by a reasonable margin. So like here, our model has a normalized root mean squared error of about 18% of the true CIF, the true average CIF, whereas others are above 20%. So yeah, just in relative terms, it outperforms baselines by reducing the root mean squared error by about 9 to 10%. And this also holds even if the tile is completely unseen, and also across multiple resolutions and crop types. So here's just an example of what the model can output. So on the bottom left here, this is the actual ground truth fine resolution CIF map. And the top left is kind of the satellite image that the model takes in as input. Okay, so basically the 3 columns represent predictions for different algorithms. Sorry, so the bottom row is the actual predictions, and the top row is the error of these predictions. And while it's actually pretty similar, you can actually see that in our model, which is the furthest right, the predictions tend to be slightly closer to the ground truth. Like there are fewer dark red or dark blue pixels, and more of them are yellow, which indicates more accurate predictions. Okay, so just to conclude this part of the talk, we developed this method, coarsely supervised smooth unit, which can predict CIF at a very fine resolution, even when only coarse resolution CIF measurements are available. And due to localization properties, it can figure out which farms have higher or lower CIF. And we need to use some regularization methods, such as early stopping and the smoothness loss, to ensure that similar pixels map to similar CIF. So hopefully this fine resolution CIF estimates could facilitate improvements in crop yield prediction and monitoring. And hopefully this might be generalizable to other related problems, such as predicting soil moisture and evapotranspiration at fine resolutions. Well, any questions up to this point?
Could I just ask, on the ground truth data, is that MDVI or what?
Good question. So the ground truth data actually comes from an airplane. It's from the CFIS data set. So this is only available for very limited farms, so we can't like use this everywhere, but it's just a validation to see if our predictions are even close.
So it is CIF data?
Yeah, it is CIF measured from an airplane, I believe. Okay. Yeah, okay. Cool, okay, so I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just briefly discuss our other project on harnessing geospatial and temporal information in crop yield prediction. Okay, so our goal here is, again, now we actually want to forecast real crop yields in advance, given some weather and environmental data. And it would be nice to do this in the middle of the growing season, such as well before harvest. So there's a lot of work applying machine learning to this problem before. I won't go into this, but basically, a lot of this assumes that each county is independent and they do not take advantage of geospatial correlations or just correlations between nearby counties. In fact, a lot of machine learning methods assume that each data point is completely independent of each other. But in here, nearby counties' yields are actually correlated. They're not like independent or identically distributed. So knowing features from nearby counties, in addition to the county that you care about, can provide some important spatial context. Like for example, parts of the county near the border with another county might actually be more similar to this other county than the center of its own county. And seeing information from nearby counties thus kind of provides information about larger regional trends. So in this project, so far we've used a graph neural network to model these spatial correlations, where again, the graph here is kind of the adjacency graph of US counties, where counties are nodes and counties are connected if they're just adjacent to each other. Okay, so we use a lot of different data sets for this problem, and just pre-processing this was a significant amount of effort. Basically, we use weather data, like temperature, precipitation, moisture, And then we also use this land surface model variable land surface model data to capture soil moisture at different levels in the ground. We also use soil survey data to kind of capture the long-term characteristics of the soil in a particular region. So we pre-process this by converting all the time-varying features to weekly, and then computing the average of each feature for each county. Okay, so our method briefly, I'll explain our method. So we start with just the input features, such as weather and soil data for a particular county and a sequence of 5 years. So why do we use 5 years? Well, it turns out that there's also like long-term trends in crop yields, such as crop yields have been increasing over time. So we think that using a sequence of 5 years might be helpful. So we have these input features and we first pass them through an initial set of convolutional neural networks that can extract features from this sequential data. So what I mean is, because for example, the weather data has a value for each week. So we use a CNN, a 1D convolutional neural network, to extract features from this like weekly time series. Similarly, for the soil GSurgo data, we don't have a value for each week. It's fixed over time, but it actually varies across different depths in the soil. So we can also use the CNN to extract features from that. Okay, so now that the CNN has kind of extracted some useful information from these sequences, we use a graph neural network to aggregate information from nearby counties. So basically, just briefly, for a given county, you can sample the neighborhood for nearby counties, and then you aggregate some feature information from the neighbors. So basically, the other counties are also giving you some information about how the weather conditions are in those counties. And then finally, once you've aggregated all this information, you can then predict the final label or crop yield for this county. Yeah, and then finally, after this graph neural network kind of aggregates information from nearby counties, we then pass the output of this through a recurrent neural network, an LSTM, that can process features from the series of years. And then it outputs the final crop yield prediction. Okay, so generally the training procedure, we simply do the usual where we compute the error, so the predicted yield versus the true yield using this function, basically just the measure of how wrong the predictions are. And then you backpropagate this error and adjust the model parameters to try to reduce the error. And then you repeat. So we test this model on different data sets, such as corn and soybean, and years 2018 and 2019. So if we test the model on year 2018, this means that we actually train on the years up to like t-2, like 2 years before. And then you validate the model on the previous year, which means selecting the model hyperparameters and like validating it to make sure it works well. And then you finally test it on this year t, which has never been seen during training. Yeah, and basically these results show that our GNN RNN approach outperforms a whole host of competing methods in terms of prediction accuracy and R-squared. And this generally holds across multiple crop types and years. So just here's an example results of like 2018 corn, for example. So this scatter plot just plots the predicted on the y-axis with a true ground truth crop yield on the x-axis. And you can see that they're generally pretty close to this line, which indicates accurate predictions. And here is just the map. On the top is the predicted crop yield using our model. And the middle one is the true corn yield. So you can see that it's generally picking up, at least on some of the geographical trends in which counties have higher and lower crop yield. Yeah, and basically this also works pretty well, even at a early stage. So if we want to predict in the middle of the year, kind of a very basic approach we could use is just pick a date. And then after that, up to that date, we use the actual features for that year. But after that date, we pretend that that's in the future. So after that date, we just replace those features. We remove them and just replace them with the historical averages. So this is kind of like a pretty naive method to do early prediction. Yeah, but using this method, our GNN RNN framework still generally does the best. Okay, so in conclusion on this part, we developed a GNN RNN framework to harness geospatial and temporal structure for crop yield prediction, since we know that nearby counties are correlated and share information. This model outperforms existing methods across a wide variety of crops and years, and hopefully these model predictions could help us forecast the effects of climate change and facilitate humanitarian planning to alleviate food security challenges. Okay, any questions on this part of the talk? Yes.
Do you normalize out differences between counties? I'm asking this question because I'm from the state of Delaware, and I'm aware that there are counties in this country that are bigger than my state.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So that would lead me to wonder that maybe bigger counties might smoothen out certain parameters that you desire as compared to smaller counties.
Right. Yeah. So I guess that's a great question. So I think the yield measurements we're after here are actually in bushels per acre. So it is normalized by the acres of farmland in the county, I believe. Yeah, but I guess, yeah, there are definitely still a lot of intrinsic differences between counties, and in future work, we hope to kind of analyze these more.
Another question, how does it handle irrigated land? Like Nebraska has a lot of irrigated land.
Right, yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, currently we don't use this information, but I think we do hope to add it in the future because, yeah, you're right that irrigated land has very different patterns than non-irrigated land. Yeah, so I think this is actually one of the biggest, biggest issues that we want to address in future work. Yeah.
I have a question, but I want to leave it to the end of the.
Sure, yeah. Sounds good, yeah. Cool, I guess I'll just quickly end here. So basically, just a few general thoughts. So we're now collecting this massive amounts of data about the world from satellites and ground sensors and weather stations and so on. So in order to make sense of this massive amount of data, we actually need techniques to be able to understand patterns in the data and then be able to predict things about the world. So deep learning can provide a valuable technique to do this. And it often shines on large labeled data sets. But if there's not enough data, then more work research-wise is needed. And my approaches are kind of a step towards this direction. So on the AI side, some opportunities for future work might include integrating process-based crop models to provide some additional prior scientific knowledge, or better algorithms for domain adaptation, where like if you train a model on the US and try to apply it directly in an African country, this tends to not work very well because of these massive differences in their environment. So like hopefully you can develop better methods for transferring this knowledge over and adapting to these shifts. And there are also some work that our group has been doing on multi-output prediction, where we want to predict multiple outputs simultaneously, and methods that account better for the spatio-temporal structure. Like our method is a good approach for this, but I think that there are opportunities for future advancements. Cool. And on the application side, there are many possibilities to use machine learning, I believe, in plant breeding, for example, where we want to predict phenotypes from like the genotype, environment, and management data. And for example, finding the genes that are associated most with a trait of interest. And there's also some work on analyzing hyperspectral images, which might produce additional data for monitoring vegetation for diseases or other things. And going back to the first project, we could potentially downscale more variables, such as soil moisture, evapotranspiration, biomass, and carbon sequestration levels, etc. By just hopefully predicting these at a finer scale could improve our understanding of climate change or help inform better decisions. And I want to thank my wonderful collaborators, including Jiaming, who's here, and a lot of other, Dee, Jiaming, Junwen, and Jun for just a lot of help on the technical aspects and data set collection, as well as Professor Ying Sun, Ariel Ortiz-Bobea, and my advisor, Carla Gomes. And here are some of the funding sources and acknowledgements and references. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Informative and highly engaging seminar for non-computer scientists. I learned a lot. So any questions from you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That was great. I'm a soil scientist, so bear with me with the questions that I have. I was also interested in the question of scale and size of the information. And you spoke a little bit to that, but I know that from soils and landscapes, when we look at different scales, variability and diversity changes dramatically, not always with the same rules. And so with some of the information, you're locked into the size of the information. I understand with the SIF, for instance, it comes in a certain areal size. Other information like field boundaries come in another size, but they can also change. Some fields are big, and in Africa, they're tiny. And so I'm wondering whether you need fundamentally different ways of dealing with these different sizes when you go across the landscape. And the other question is, are you trying to get also some functional relationships out of that, not just being able to predict for a reason that you don't know, but actually understanding what certain factors, how important certain factors are, so that we, for instance, can adjust management across the landscape, not just predict.
That's a great question. So yeah, I guess to answer your first question about the multi-scale modeling, I think that is definitely a very important area for future work. So like there are some neural network algorithms, such as like convolutional neural networks, that can kind of model features at different scales, but it's still not very intrinsic, I would say. Like, I mean, what these things do is generally try to kind of first analyze what's going on at a fine scale, extract some useful information from the fine resolution data, and then kind of aggregate it further to provide more global information. Yeah, I think, yeah, figuring out how to work with like data sets of different resolutions is kind of an active area of research that is very exciting. Yeah, and I guess for your other question on kind of getting the functional capabilities, the functional forms of how this process works, I think, yeah, I agree that's very important for scientific purposes. Yeah, so I think in general, historically, machine learning has not been the best at doing this, but there is a lot of work on more like explainable machine learning algorithms that can not only predict crop yield, but also kind of try to explain like what variables it actually used to make this prediction and like why it made the prediction it did. Yeah, I haven't actually dived into these too much, but I think there is a lot of active research on this topic, just for the dimensions you mentioned.
Any other questions?
So for your first project, you're using the UNet. If I understand things correctly, it seems that the novelty and the success that that method brings is due to the fact that you can make connections at the pixel level between different pixels. Have you quantified how well the algorithms are for you to declare those connections and compare that the success of those algorithms with your output for your SIF predictions? Like, for instance, let's say your algorithm that says that these two pixels are related because they're of the same farm size. You can say that algorithm is 85% efficacious, but then your final SIF prediction might be 60% successful. How can you quantify the differences between those two prediction problems? And is that a concern?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so I guess what you mentioned is like, yeah, because we're taking advantage of the fact that we assume that, like, say, farms with similar SIF might also have similar, say, reflectance values. And this is, in fact, an assumption from prior knowledge that we are kind of making. And yeah, and so the accuracy of the model in turn will depend on how accurate this assumption is. And there are various ways to kind of tweak the assumption, how strong it is. Yeah, but I guess in terms of the absolute accuracy, it is somewhat hard to tell. In fact, part of the reason why, for example, in the SIF case, the R squared was not super high, like 0.65, for example, was actually because of noise in the true label that we're trying to predict. So because the airplane sensors of SIF itself is noisy, so like maybe the model is actually doing better, but it's being classified as incorrect because the actual measurement was noisy. So yeah, but that is a really interesting question and hope to explore it more.
But you are confident that your reflectivity algorithm that connects two different pixels, that's highly accurate.
Actually, I am, yeah, actually that part is a bit more uncertain, actually. Like it's actually based on just correlations that I am inferring. But in general, like I test for this by like just making this assumption and seeing like how well are the fine resolution SIF predictions representing the ground truth afterwards. Yeah, like this assumption, like I guess you could definitely tune it a bit, but it's still not completely foolproof. Like you can still have like pixels that are very similar, but actually they're a bit different in SIF because of reasons that are not observed in the data sets.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you for your talk. It's more a technical question. What computer language are you using, or computer languages? And would a kind of this deep learning model still run on a reasonable, well-equipped laptop, or do you have to go to like to run it on the server, or do you do it under Windows or Linux?
Great question. Yeah, so in general, most deep learning code nowadays is implemented in Python.
Okay.
There are a lot of libraries such as PyTorch or TensorFlow that can do this. Yeah, in terms of the computational cost, that is a big concern with modern deep learning models. Typically, it's a lot more efficient to run them if you have access to a GPU. So like graphics processing unit. So in general, like I've run most of my work on a server that has a GPU. That you could run it on a laptop, but it'll probably be kind of slow-ish. Depending on the amount of data you have is the biggest factor, actually. Yeah, if you have like a small data set, you could actually run it on a laptop. But large one will take a long time.
I have a question, right? I put my question as the last one. I think I know enough about the first project and the second project that is super interesting. I wonder if you're taking the time series of climate data and also a static soil data. Of course, both have this spatially varying habits. But how to account for irrigation tool management practices like irrigation? But there has been also like genetic improvements. Over the years there are changes of polymers. How that kind of information is, and also the breeding program and genetic changes have been playing a big role for boosting the crop yield. So, but no features were included in the model, right? And I sort of understand if you're only validating the last 2 years, but using all the previous years to the prediction, that might just work fine. But because you already, I don't know, I just feel like how you can really consider that a genetic improvement.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right that we don't have a great data set for the genetic variation yet, I would appreciate advice on this. But basically, prior work just notices that crop yields in general have been increasing over time. So there is like that long-term improvement, and it tries to control for this by actually, what I didn't mention is that this algorithm also takes a feature in representing the kind of average yield of the previous year.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
the question I want to ask,
Yeah.
because if you are using previous year's yield to predict next year, so that means the genetic and the management information are already taken into implicitly taken into consideration, right?
Yeah.
But if that is the case, is the weather information in previous years still like useful in this context, because you already have previous year's yield plus current year's like weather information, then you can probably already do a very good job, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that is correct. I think we're just choosing to, we're actually effectively choosing to predict the yield of every year in the sequence. But I guess recently we've been finding that you're right, actually, like just using the average yield from the previous year and the weather for this year is generally enough to output an accurate prediction. Yeah. So that's right.
Yeah. So yeah, if you can somehow account for the genetic information, that would be hugely important.
Any questions on? Sorry. There's one more. Feel free to leave if you need to go. But let's see. So there's a question on. So what is the purpose of only training with coarse data? Why wouldn't it be better to train on both fine and coarse? This is a great question. So basically, we're trying to simulate the setting where only coarse data is available. And yeah, so essentially, for SIF, for example, like the fine scale data is only very limited in the amount of area that it covers. So we're trying to actually develop a method that can work only if you have coarse, even if you only have coarse scale data. But of course, like the more fine scale data you have, the better the model can also train. And it's actually very easy to change it so that you also train on the fine scale data. Cool. And then what are the causes of the obvious discrepancies in the corn belt? Your method predicted more uniformly than the actual, and it seems like the adjacent counties would have taken care of that. Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So I can't say for sure, but I think my guess on what is happening here is that so in reality in 2018, like these counties in the middle of Illinois actually had like extremely high crop yields that had never been seen in the training data set before. So I don't think the model would actually be able to directly learn that if it hasn't really seen similar examples in the data it's trained on. But yeah, this is a really important limitation.
And yeah, related to that question, say, is this model able to predict, say, extreme drought year, say 2012, there's like huge drop of the yield, right? Yeah. If your data like from the 1980s to now does not see a year like 2012,
yeah,
can you still?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think in principle, like if you have seen an extreme drought year, it should be able to understand the patterns behind that. But if you haven't, then I guess it would be hard for it to kind of reason that like this huge dryness will drastically decrease yields if it hasn't seen this in the data. But I think this is an area that we want to look into because yeah, it might be able to like extrapolate, but extrapolation is generally pretty hard. Yeah.
Would this be an opportunity to incorporate like a mechanistic model?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think a mechanistic model that knows that like droughts cause like really bad decreases in crop yield would be very helpful here.
Kind of take over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. Very good.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.